Welcome everyone to Book at Lunchtime in week 4 of Trinity Term 2023. I say this date and the time partly because for those of you who are new to Book at Lunchtime, it might be good to know that this is one of Torch's longest standing flagship events. We have films of every single Book at Lunchtime session featured going back to 2013. So Book at Lunchtime has a growing history and heritage, including online. And as those of you who are any good at maths will be able to tell, we are therefore celebrating 10 years of Book at Lunchtime this term. The podcasts and videos of all the previous discussions are, as I say, a popular feature of our website and YouTube channel, and we've been privileged to feature an astonishing variety of books and authors over the years. Today, we'll be discussing Ruth Harris's brilliant book, Guru to the World, The Life and Legacy of Vivekananda. There have been some wonderful reviews of this book already, including one, and I'm going to just read from the back cover, from Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, who describes it fulsomely, and I'm just going to pick out one little sentence. This is a vivid portrait of India's Vivekananda, in which we discover a compelling story of interconnected lives. The Guru, his disciple, the international followers, his own teacher. These lives shed new light on religion, race, gender, colonialism, and nationalism. Ruth and I were talking just earlier about, in a way, the degree of madness it took to take on this project. I've known Ruth a very long time. I work, as some of you will know, in 16th, 17th century French history. I've known Ruth as a French historian. What on earth is she doing going into this world? Well, as guides to tell us both about this book and about those worlds of religion, race, gender, colonialism, and nationalism, I'm very pleased to say that our two panelists today are Professor Anki Mukherjee and Professor Stephen Tuck. Anki, as again regulars will know, was one of our featured authors last year, and Stephen is a former, indeed was the founding director of Torch. So we're an expert and experienced hands for today's discussion, and it's my pleasure to kick things off today. I think, Ruth, I think it'd be nice if you started by reading a passage.
I was explaining that I didn't choose a passage because I was embarrassed to read from my own book, and he's been urging me
No, that's
to
okay.
go ahead.
Well, then let's leave you a moment.
No, but I prepared something different.
Okay, fine, in that case.
I wanted instead to explain to you about why it was that I did this crazy thing of leaving French history and starting a book on Vivekananda. Can I start by asking how many in the room have heard of Vivekananda? Okay, so it's actually, in an English-speaking audience, one of the most informed that I've encountered, because mostly people have never heard of him. And I, of course, had not heard of him. I had instead been reading the correspondence between Romain Rolland, who's the famous French pacifist, who went to Switzerland to live, as he said, above the Mallee during the terrible moment of the First World War. And I found, to my astonishment, that there was a fantastic set of correspondence between him and Gandhi. And I read that, and then as I read it, I became to understand that Rolland had spent almost a decade engaged in studying what he called Eastern mysticism. And this is part of the whole process of Orientalism, that somehow the East would inform the West and teach us the lessons of mildness. And as you know, Rolland got the Nobel Prize the year after Tagore, who was the first non-white person to get it. They became great friends, though Roland's impressions of Tagore are astonishing. Tagore would speak for 3 hours, and Rolland would go like this. And since Rolland loved to talk as much as Tagore, it shows something about the way these remarkable giants, great men perceived themselves, and who actually was considered the more the greater polymath. And so this time Tagore wins. But in the process of these discussions with Tagore, he also writes a book on Ramakrishna and Vivekananda. And I didn't know this. And so I read these books and they astonished me. I didn't understand. I'd never heard of these people. And it suddenly made me realize that this whole relationship between Ramakrishna, Vivekananda, Tagore, and Gandhi, which is not a genealogy that necessarily would go together today, was very important to how Gandhi was sold to the West and how Gandhi was perceived. Now, the book ended up being something so different from anything I'd ever done. It is a global and transnational history, but I suggest and pray that it's not like the global history that's based on notions of circulation and ideas and metastructures, but instead one that's focused deeply on relationships and connection. And this is this is normally associated with forms of microhistory or even history of emotions and subjectivity, and the two often don't come together. In fact, there are even those gender historians who used to say in the past that they turned to global history as a way of getting rid of all that touchy-feely stuff that the women were now doing. But in fact, what I was suggesting, and I think it's really important, is that any study of global spirituality, which is what this book is about, must rely on what is relational between people, but also what's relational in terms of notions of devotion and adoration and connection. I also was trying to elaborate on a throw-off term that Chris Bailey used. He was the great Indian historian who died, I guess now already 10 years ago, when he spoke about the global idealist moment. How do people connect when they come from very different cultural milieu? And one of the ways in which they did it was through this notion of idealism, an idealism that was both philosophical but also practical. It involved theosophy, it involved vegetarianism, it involved Christian Science, it involved yoga. But I will do my best to show that Vivekananda is not a New Age guru, though that is often the way people perceive him in retrospect, that is a misconception. And then I hoped to sort of alter what people thought about intellectual history. Normally, intellectual history is about cross currents of textuality. And what I was trying to suggest is that if we're looking at the history of the subject, the inner world, what Vivekananda called subjective consciousness, he did not use the word subjectivity, then we have to try and understand often its embodied nature. So it is not just about the brain or about what we write, but about our whole being, but also about emotion. I mean, there is so much about intellectual history, the mind, that is based on inspiration through relationships. And one of the things that Vivekananda always said, he talked about tirthas, which were crossroads, spiritual crossroads. For example, Benares is the ultimate spiritual crossroad, I'd say, in India. But he wrote something remarkable where he said, for me, the greatest tirtha is other human beings. And so this was his affirmation of the idea that the divine was within each human being and that these were the crossroads that one had to know. And I would suggest also that what made him remarkable was that he observed, and taking the lessons from Ramakrishna, he said, you have to speak in the language of the person you are addressing. Now, this is part of the teaching of what it is to be a great guru. Each individual, each disciple requires bespoke teaching. But because he was a spiritual democrat, he also believed that you needed to connect with people on their own terms. And so what's amazing is you read when he goes to this place, Greenacre, where there's all these avant-garde people at American spirituality. And he talks to them in the language that they understand. What's amazing is how he separates out all the different Christian ideas, Swedenborgianism, Christian Science, mesmerism. He makes fun of them, but he's also remarkably open and then finds bridging concepts. The book is about a, quote, great man, but most of it is about women. And that was one of the things that I meant to invert the usual by saying women were the ones who followed him, in the West at least, and women were the ones who disseminated his understandings. For example, Roland gets all the material from one of his dearest disciples and friends, Josephine MacLeod. And Roland, you know, in his diary makes fun of her. He calls her a dilettante, and he says that she doesn't speak French well. He's monoglot. He can't even speak a word of English. So he has his sister doing all the translating for him. So he's arrogant to boot. But he doesn't get it. In fact, she's remarkable. She knows how to play the role. So she makes sure that he gets all the information, and he writes the books about Vivekananda and Ramakrishna. And the legacy of the book, which very few people have picked up, is that it's Nivedita, Margaret Noble, a woman of Scotch-Irish origin, who globalizes his thought by attaching it to all the trends in Western geography, urban planning, and science. And finally, what I'm really trying to get at here is that Vivekananda has been completely co-opted by the current populist government, you know, who want to say that he's a progenitor of Hindutva. Well, of course, Hindutva as an ideology comes with Savarkar, not with Vivekananda. And the belligerence that we see in some of the statements he made, there's no doubt he made statements about India being the mother of spirituality, India as being, you know, superior in terms of its religion, India as better than the West in all kinds of ways. If you look, as I am doing now, at all the other so-called religious modernisms of the period, be they Buddhism or Islam, and especially Christianity, everyone is asserting that their religion is the best. This is part of the global idealist moment. And the reason that Vivekananda speaks as he does is he's fighting against Christian mission and what he perceives as the denigration of Indian civilization. I'm on to my last point, which is that often in the book, it looks as if there are two Vivekanandas, the Vivekananda of universalism and the Vivekananda of nationalism. In India today, he is known for something he said only once, that everybody in India, all the men need to carry with them a Gita and show their biceps. This was about Indian rebirth, was about assertion of a kind of aggressive Hinduism, which, by the way, was not his words, but Nivedita's words. So it's a Western woman who comes up with the word aggressive Hinduism. It's not Vivekananda. And about assertion and resurgence. In the West, he talks about universalism, an end to distraction, the need for yoga so that people can be milder, less coercive, that he wanted he perceived the West in very idealist terms, essentially as a brutal civilization. It was something that Gandhi also believed in. And that in order to take them, they needed to become more like Hindus, which is fascinating. So my conclusion is that there are not two Vivekanandas. The universalism and nationalism were always intertwined, but that what he wanted was to bring people towards the middle, away from the extremes that hampered them spiritually, emotionally, and intellectually. But at the same time, because he was a sannyasin, he also believed that there was a form of militancy that was possible for those people who had given up everything. He'd renounced everything. He was a swami. He was a sannyasin. And that in that sense, you go out into the world and you fight with complete detachment and complete renunciation, and you're willing to die in the cause. And the reason that there are these different aspects, one which is so moderate and the other which is so militant, is, in my view, the reason why Vivekananda, who dies very young at 39, is a movable feast. He can be used by the right, and he can be used by the left, and he is used and seen by the middle, and there are passages that you can take from all of them. And that is why he is so that's why people love him, in a sense. That's why he's so provocative. That's why he's so important. But unlike Gandhi, who we know, we saw what he did and how he changed over time, Vivekananda's life is a life in preparation. He dies so young that we don't know on where he would have been on the political spectrum, how he would have reacted to the freedom struggle as it changed over time in India. And so there's something mysterious and all the more alluring because he never ages. And thank you so much.
Thank you. I think it makes sense to move to Anki first. Again, just so people understand the general rules of engagement here, we ask our panel to respond to the book, to their understanding of it from their own disciplinary perspective, but also in whatever way makes sense to them. So over to you, Anki.
Thank you, Wes. I was delighted when Ruth invited me to contribute to the Book at Lunchtime event for Guru to the World, and not for boring academic reasons. I don't work on religion or Eastern philosophy, nor am I a historian of South Asia. I've spent an inordinate amount of time trying to escape what Salman Rushdie calls the God-bothered types, or we can add the Guru-bothered types, a fixture of my childhood and early youth. Yet here I was, going back to the trips to Belur Math with my grandparents, the Aarti at Belur Math. This is Khandana Bhava Bandhana Jagabandhana Bundi Tuma. It's Bengali words, but they are delivered in a peculiar, exaggerated Sanskrit pronunciation. The visits to the starched Maharajas, or Moharaj as we call them. My grandmother was devoted to a Bharat Maharaj. The framed photos and tattered calendars with Vivekananda, arms crossed and adamantine in his tunic, the motivational wallpaper for children of my generation. Sri Ramakrishna was a household name, as was Sharada Devi, his wife, Thakur and Ma, as was that milieu of feudal landlords, debauchees, renunciates, transients and philanthropists, all transfigured in their devotion to the master and in the imagined community of the Ramakrishna mission, mutt or order. Girish Ghosh, Gopaler Ma, Nag Mahashoy, Rani Rashmoni. My great-grandfather, Tara Prasanna Mukhopadhyay, had successfully fought a case for Rani Rashmoni, leading to the revoking of a tax on fishing the British had imposed on her stretch of the river Ganga. It was therefore very interesting to meet Vivekananda, Shamiji, on my own terms in 2023. Ruth Harris says in the preface that it was a band of close American friends who had abandoned Jewish or Christian beliefs for mainstream or alternative Hinduism and Buddhism, who stirred her curiosity in the subject matter of the book. I began to wonder how and why these women, nearly always women, came to such ideas and what they meant in their lives, she writes. This line of inquiry led to the book's preoccupation with the traffic between Eastern spirituality and Western seekers. Women and the problem and question of femininity function as the logical copula of this work. And in my brief comments today, I wish to dwell on this aspect of Guru to the World. The concept of Ardha Narishwara, a combination of male and female principles in Ishvara or God, is ancient. If God is in every atom, each atom is composed of an electron and a proton. The Sanskrit term for electron is vibhaga, the left half, and the proton is the dhanbhaga, the right half of the atom. So the female principle and the male principle come together to form an atom, and the cosmos, therefore, is an elaboration of the Ardhanarishwara principle. Behind the Guru to the World and the Guru's Guru stands a woman with a trident. Sri Ramakrishna's first preceptor is a woman, Bhairavi Brahmani, who is a Gaudiya Vaishnav as well as a Tantric. And, I'm kind of assuming a certain amount of foreknowledge because I don't have time to sort of disambiguate all these terms. So she guides Sri Ramakrishna through arduous Tantric rites. She introduces him also to the Vaishnava cosmology of Sri Chaitanya, a mystic who lived in Bengal from 1486 to 1533. Chaitanya is Radha and Krishna in the same body. So the Godhead Krishna and his beloved Radha. Sometimes the love-struck Radha predominates, at others it is Krishna. The deity Radharaman, a form of Krishna, the literal meaning is lover of Radha, is interchangeable with the figure of Chaitanya. So in Ramakrishna's life, in a phase of Ramakrishna's life, we see a channeling of Chaitanya, during which, and Ruth writes beautifully about it, Ramakrishna donned a wig, wore a Banarasi sari and gold ornaments, and experienced a woman's monthly cycle. Even his body began to function as a woman's, Harris writes, so that every month drops of blood would ooze from the pores. This is at once a surfeit of sexuality and a sexlessness, manifesting primarily as an egolessness. Vivekananda imbibed this from his teacher, becoming a man or a woman in his imaginings and his letters, Harris observes. Ramakrishna and Vivekananda's initiation into Advaita philosophy, with its shunning of theistic practice and ritualistic idol worship through Totapuri in the case of the former and Brahmoism in the case of Vivekananda, this did not dim their love of Kali, however ambivalent that love was in the case of Vivekananda. The encounters between Ramakrishna and his disciples were not cerebral and argumentative, but on visceral cognitive registers. Harris dwells on how Ramakrishna teaches one of them to weep with abandon. I found it very useful to trace with Harris Vivekananda's turn away from what she calls the rational iconoclasm of Brahmoism, his subsequent entertainment and rejection of Vaishnava and Shakta devotion, and his final relenting to the sensual and emotional experientialism, this is Harris's phrase, of Ramakrishna's ragatmika or passion-filled bhakti. To look back to the question or problem of the feminine, it would be absurd to claim that cosplay as a woman by powerful men improved the visibility or rights of women at the time. It would be equally problematic to lump the feminine with the body, however excursive and transgendering the possibilities of the body's transformation. As Jacques Derrida has argued in his White Mythology, metaphorics, and he is talking about the metaphor in the context of Western metaphysics here, can reinscribe and reassemble the sensory content, the body for instance, as intellectual content. All these problematic issues aside, I do see a through line between the weight of Ramakrishna's foot on Vivekananda's chest. Mind you, the word guru in Bengali or Sanskrit means serious, weighty, heavy, not just a leader or a guardian. And this itself is a tableau replicating the goddess Kali's placing of her foot on Shiva's chest, and his subsequent, so I see a through line between the weight of Ramakrishna's foot on Vivekananda's chest and his subsequent devotion and attention to mother figures. The formless ecstasy of this moment, I will argue, is a psychosomatic event that culminates in his own acts of care toward Sharadama or Nivedita. Ramakrishna and Vivekananda provided a counterpart to the Bengal Renaissance in their religious revivalism. We have brains but no hands, Vivekananda had said in Chicago, enjoining his nation and the world to acquire capability by putting the doctrine of the Vedanta to practice. His address at the 1893 World's Parliament of Religions was, "In the name of the millions of religions and in the name of millions and millions of Hindu people," demonstrating the eerie compatibility of leading thinkers and reformists of modernity in non-synchronous cultures. He talked about the carceral of the self, T.S. Eliot's "Each in his prison, thinking of the key, each confirms a prison." And he had talked also about the topography of the mind, and you show how these has echoes in Freud and William James, the surface consciousness and the palimpsestic depths of the consciousness beneath. So here he was in Chicago, carving out for India a panoptical space based on an anti-colonial representation of Hinduism as expansive and emancipatory. As Poromaroy writes in Indian Traffic, for him Hinduism and nationalism both became very specifically an address to the West, and this is something that's captured in great detail in the book. The period encapsulated in Guru to the World is very much the best of times and the worst of times, and if there is a Bengali reader here, I would recommend Sunil Gangopadhyay's Shei Shomoy. In her path-breaking work, Colonial Masculinity, Mrinalini Sinha has written about the 4 specific controversies that influenced identity formation in the 2 final decades of the 19th century. The White Mutiny against the Ilbert Bill in 1883, the government response to the Native Volunteer Movement in 1885, the recommendations of the Public Service Commission of 1886, and the Indian opposition to the Age of Consent Bill in 1891. The binary opposition of colonizer and colonized came undone in the clash and contestation of identities around these issues. The contrast between the effete Bengali and the manly Englishman, for instance, even as colonial education and administration churned out generations of mimic men, subordinate in class, education, and power. Vivekananda's masculinity, or his labile gender identity, needs to be read against the threat of emasculation and his own cultural phobia of femininity in men. The role of women in this schema is predictable. Collapsed into the desexualized ideal of Mother India or Mother Kali, the mother of the universe, sublated into the spiritual domain where the East retains a positional superiority over the West, or immobilized in her role as staunch devotee to her husband, master. Ruth Harris's granular account of Vivekananda's interactions with his women acquaintances and disciples in India and the West helps us add nuance and detail to the figure of this fierce reformer, critical of social conventions as they crippled the lives of women, such as child marriage, premature childbearing, or marital rape. We also confront the limits of this liberalism, the excessive idealization of the mother-son relationship, the summary exclusion of women from the libidinal economy, Vivekananda's opposition to widow remarriage on the grounds that widowhood should be treated akin to a spiritual vocation. As Harris writes, he endorsed the power of expiatory exercises but failed to address the specific plight of widows and the way, for many, such austerities lasted decades. Brahmavid Brahmaiva Bhavati, goes the Vedic dictum. The knower of Brahman verily becomes Brahman. Ramakrishna once said that Narendra, his name for Vivekananda was Naren, will pass away only of his own will. So the moment he realizes who he is, he will refuse to stay a moment longer in the body, Ramakrishna said. I want to end with 2 lingering images from the last days of Vivekananda's life. The relationship between the master and disciple, Vivekananda and Margaret Noble, was tumultuous, with Nivedita writing, I was made to realize as the days went by that in this there will be no personal sweetness. On July 2nd, 1902, Vivekananda blessed Nivedita and washed her hands. He had also insisted on fanning her while she ate. Nivedita had protested, saying, Swami, I hate you to do this. I should do it for you. And Vivekananda had replied laughingly, but Jesus washed the feet of his disciples. There's a very gendered dimension to these acts. I seem to think Vivekananda had spoken about it in Chicago, but there is definitely that he would have treated with derision the injunction in the Skanda Purana of the wife having to offer oblations, sacred oblations to her Lord, washing his feet and drinking the water. Not only did Vivekananda know in these exchanges with Nivedita that this was the Last Supper, the distinction between Guru Shishya and man and woman had finally ceased to matter. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm sure there will be questions. That certainly raised a whole series of thoughts to which Ruth will have a chance to respond in a minute. But we now move on to Stephen, and then we'll gather the questions together towards the end, if that's okay.
Yes. Okay. Well, thank you, Wes. Thank you, John, very much for organising everything. Thank you for those comments, Anki, and thank you, Ruth, for inviting me to be on this panel. And thank you all for coming on this beautiful sunny day or this busy moment of term. When Wes was talking about book at lunchtime, I sometimes think it's kind of Torch's gentle beating heart over the last decade, where people from a range of interests, I guess, in this room reflect together on new research that raises important issues for us to think about, and that's exactly what this book does, and I'm very pleased that it's one of the Book of Lunchtime series. By way of introduction, my connection is very different from yours to the subject matter. I'm going to make comments from the vantage point of my own work in late 19th century US religious history. I'm writing a biography of an African-American pastor who was very much not a pastor to the world. In fact, he rarely left his own town or his own city and didn't leave the country. So it was really instructive for me personally, so thank you for that. But before I make comments on the content of the book, I do want to start by saying that Guru to the World is an absolute pleasure to read. Good history books are always informative and thought-provoking, which this biography very much is. But truth be told, they're not always page-turners. But and that's okay. But this book is an engaging story as well as a deeply researched history. When I was reading it, readiness for this panel, I found I quickly moved from the desk and a laptop to the armchair with a cup of tea. In fact, many cups of tea, because I didn't move. I just sat and read as long as I could in that sitting, and then the same again the next day. It's beautifully written and also beautifully illustrated. I mean, to look at the cover, which, if you read the book, is appropriately coloured for Vivekananda's style, but also beautifully illustrated with photographs, many that give us a lot to ponder just by looking at the images alongside the words. So this is all a way of saying, as we are approaching the summer, no better time to get a big book to read, because it will absorb us for a while. And if you're someone who's in the middle also of this busy state of term, this is exactly the moment to sit down and read it. So Vivekananda's life is a remarkable story, and the title captures it, Guru to the World. An Indian spiritual leader who becomes a sensation in the United States, and then that in turn enhances his reputation and influence in his own nation and beyond globally. But though it's a global history, it's an intensely personal history. The Guru to the world is also the Guru to particular people, and we learn about them in depth, as we've already heard, so I won't say more on that, particularly some of Vivekananda's women companions who have their own impact and legacies for the world. The book is divided into 3 sections, just so you know how it works, and the sections are very clear: India, the US, India and the world. And the structure is so helpful and clear that I didn't really reflect on it. I thought this is probably just self-evident, this is how it should be structured, but I suspect on reflection that these were choices made after long thought and deliberation and angst. But anyway, I want to say it works incredibly well, because I imagine anybody reading it will feel possibly at home in one section and all at sea in the other section, and the clarity of it was really a model of how to guide a reader through. So, whilst this is a history of Vivekananda's life and legacy, or life and times, it's also a history of those times. He was not just a guru to the world, but when we read the book, we see he was a guru of the world. He was a guru from this moment. I knew virtually nothing of Vivekananda's life and travels, but the US section of the book immediately felt familiar, the one that he entered. His teaching fit it perfectly. The religious and social context and Vivekananda seemed to fit almost hand in glove in some ways, and hence his influence, I'm sure. This was a generation in the United States that saw the rejection of dogmatic certainties. It saw the privileging of religious experience over religious doctrine. It was the moment where there was a rise of what was called new thought and self-realization of the potential for the divine within. Now, historians in my particular field have stressed recently the importance of not framing these what you might call new spiritualities in the US as deviations from a supposed Christian mainstream, let alone as they were dismissed at the time, often as cults and sects. But rather that if as historians we centre these new spiritualities that came from within and against, and sometimes beyond, as in this case, the established Christian tradition, we gain new understandings of the development of identities, ideas, and institutions more generally. And reading Vivekananda's travels in the US is a journey into this period. We sort of, through his eyes, see this world. And it's a world and a moment, of course, that's foundational for our own times now in many ways. Well, I've got many questions to ask at another time, but I'm just going to ask a couple today, if that's okay, and they all relate to the question of audiences. Now, in the first place, our subject, Vivekananda, faced remarkably different audiences. India, the United States, the world, even within the United States. At one moment, he's speaking to the World Parliament of Religions in a huge exposition. In another, he's on an intimate retreat in kind of wooded New England. And one of the fascinating aspects of his life, which raises any number of questions, is how adept he is at traversing these audiences. You've already spoken to that. Many people travel, but not many people are able to speak so effectively. But actually, I was more interested really in the questions about the research, because anybody, and I read the footnotes carefully, anybody doing the research into this life will have had to travel themselves extensively, probably exhaustingly and adventurously. And my question really for the author, and I sometimes think these sessions are really a way that we can ask the author the questions that we can't get from the text, is whether your experience of traversing all those different intellectual cultures and societies, in what ways did that influence your historical interpretations or fired your historical imagination writing about this particular story? Another question of audience is about the audiences we do read about in the book. And we read about a lot of them. And they tend to be audiences that Vivekananda was either very formative for or that he critiqued. But in the US, the audience that I know about a bit actually didn't like him at all. And their response was to critique him incredibly strongly. They didn't like anything about him or anything that he stood for. And his ideas, his popularity and his appearance and his authenticity, they all came under attack. Now, I didn't know much about it. So for my own research, in the light of reading the book, I had a quick sort of study for something I'm working on. And, you know, there are long articles in the Christian press, like the vivisection of Vivekananda. Or there are tabloid, and I kid you not, tabloid-style religious hit pieces on his motives and behaviour and what he did and what he was up to. Now this audience in the US is not the focus of your book, and rightly so. That's not what it's about.
You can write another book on that.
Yes, but I wondered what your reflection might be on this opposition, what that tells us about his own impact in the first place, if he's provoking all these people to lengthy pieces, and what it says about the religious establishment there. That's certainly something that I'm going to think about in consequence. Mm-hmm. Now, if the subject had to navigate different audiences, the author clearly had to navigate different audiences too. Now, we've heard about this a bit, but I found the introduction really thought-provoking, Ruth, where you said that those interested in United States history have largely overlooked Vivekananda. And in a sort of straw poll of colleagues, that's certainly the case. Whereas those invested in Indian history may have very high stakes in his memory. Now, it seems to me that most biographies, when we read them, they either recover a forgotten life, for the most part, or reinterpret an extremely well-known life. You know, they either introduce a character to us, or they challenge what we thought about a character. And I was struck that this book, at all times, is doing both of those things simultaneously. It's not, you know, it's a guru to the world, but you're having to guide two very different worlds into this subject. And I just suppose, you know, methodological question, I'd be interested to know how your acute awareness of these two very different audiences affected your research and your writing choices. And I deliberately didn't look so as not to influence my own reading, but how these different audiences have responded to the book since its publication. Anyway, a final reflection for a broader audience who may not be invested in either US or Indian history, which may be most of us, either here or watching. Guru to the World foregrounds the inner spiritual life in its interpretation of the unfolding of history, or many histories around the world. And the book shows how for a range of individuals, their conception of their spiritual profoundly affected not just their own self or mind, but their actions and choices and impacts they made well beyond the sphere of anything we might call religious or spiritual. And I think what this book made me reflect on is that in every age, that's true. People make choices regarding the spiritual, be they exploring so-called new forms of spirituality, or personally devoted to a particular religious tradition, or atheist or agnostic, or whatever camp they are in or move between. Now, I suspect it's much easier for a historian to write about religious structures than interpersonal beliefs. But going to the world, I found very challenging of the importance of recognizing the spiritual and a model of how to do it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. Before I move to Ruth, I really would just like to thank both respondents really enormously for having opened up both a series of very personal engagements and a degree of expertise in two very distinct areas. And I think, Ruth, you talked about there being not two Vivekanandas, but you've had two great readers here.
Oh boy.
And I just invite you then to respond to these two great readers in whatever way seems to work.
Well, you know, when you write these books, this book took me 10 years to write, 8 to 10 years. And it took everything I had. And I was explaining that in the 4th year of writing it, I finally said to myself, this time you've done it. You've bitten off too much. And I was explaining earlier to Anki that in the 4th year, I still didn't understand enough of the Hindu metaphysical concepts to even write about them. And I wept. I come from Abrahamic tradition, religious tradition. Advaita was so difficult. And then, I grew up in a world, I'm of Jewish origin, where people talk about, the idols of, that there's only one God. And then to finally, just as I was despairing, I began to understand just enough to start to write. Just to explain to you, it takes Indians who are devotees spend their lives understanding. So it's not that I worried about that, but I was trying to understand on even a very basic level. And I think that Anki was talking about some very specific things that probably many of you have never heard of. But if you can imagine what it means for a Bengali, she's a Bengali, Vivekananda was a Bengali, to be able to understand and appreciate what I did, it for me is, 10 times glory. And I think that her concentration on the gender aspect is so important because, again, I didn't mention about Ramakrishna, but as he said, for him, the Atman, the subtle body, the soul, was not gendered. And when they asked him, his disciples, are you a man or a woman? And he replied, I do not know. And so that within the Hindu tradition, there is a place in the sacred for this kind of gender fluidity that has become so fiercely contested at the moment, and yet was always contained very forcefully within aspects of Hindu philosophy and practice. And what's so interesting is that the stereotype of Vivekananda is that he was the opposite. It was that he was the manly man. She used the term the monolith. He's projected in the schools as, the embodiment of resurgence, Hindu resurgence against the stereotype of effete Bengali men. But of course, what I show, and this is an argument I was making without really talking about it at length because I was trying to write for a wider audience, was that Ashish Nandi, one of the great psychoanalysts in India, always said that what was the problem with Vivekananda was that he killed his inner femininity. And of course, this is not the case at all. And in fact, one of the reasons for his great success in America was that amongst the women, why they loved him so much was that he could combine the sage, the Hindu sage, the intellectual, the jnani, with a man who was so caring, so maternal, and so funny. The whole thing was the childlike nature. Ramakrishna was famously childlike. And although Vivekananda wanted to show that he was indeed the ultimate grown-up, when he was in these intimate contexts with these women, he enabled that child to emerge. And one of the things about the spiritual nature of the child in their thinking is that the child sits in the lap of Kali. It sits in the mother's lap and surrenders to her protection. And what was so interesting is that his Western followers, somebody like Margaret Noble, she hated it when he did that because she thought he'd lost his masculinity, as indeed he had, and that he was going into an inner state that would prevent him from being the activist man that she wanted. But in fact, when he would go into these states, they were the states of trying to find detachment again, where you surrender to the divine. And that empowers you again to go out into activism. And the whole thing that they were doing with activism was to show that Indians were not deficient in character, that they were able to be active in the world, that they weren't Hegel's description of the love of pure spirit, but that they too could fight against colonialism, oppression, and all of that. So I can't believe your family had anything to do with Rashmoni. This is the woman who's from a very low caste, and she finds a way, she's very rich, to build the temple. And I mean, like all Bengalis, they're all related to one another. But the idea that her family was involved in this great struggle is amazing to me. Now, to go back here to this thing about travel and different frames of reference. Yeah, I had to travel all over America, and I had to beg for the letters, because there's a great historical controversy. About 25 years ago, a quarter of a century ago, there was an American historian named Kripal who wrote about Ramakrishna, but who suggested that to understand him, you had to understand him through homosexuality or homoeroticism. And this was extremely painful to Indian believers, many of whom are also even people who are non-Hindus, because Ramakrishna was one of the few thinkers that went across many religious divides. And because of that, people were afraid to help me. And even though they were very kind to me at Bellarmat, she was explaining that's where she went as a child, Anki went as a child, they did not let me see the papers. But they're so grateful to me that although I criticize, and especially this thing about the relationship to women, not as ideals, but as living human beings, which even his disciples felt uncomfortable with as they tried to deal with his idealization of women. You know, what happens if you're idealized? You know, you can't have children, you can't marry, you can't have sex, you can't engage in all kinds of relationships because you're a woman. And they did. I mean, they became, they were celibate, you know, and sometimes this condition, and as you said at the very beginning, there's no personal sweetness here, you know. This is not what they do it for. Renunciation meant a form of mastery that was based on not self-denial, but sacrifice. And it's very hard, I think, in our Western ways of thinking to understand the role of sacrifice in many of these ideologies of the 20th century, especially the political ones. Now, I'm going to go on to say, yes, I mean, traveling to India was extraordinary, wonderful, but also difficult. Very difficult because, you know, people wondered what I was doing there. Why would I bother? This time I went first to Sri Lanka. I thought of doing work on Dharmapala. And I went alone, and everyone looked at me and they just couldn't understand why I was there without my husband and children. And when I came to Bellarmine and to the Institute in Calcutta, I took my husband. He came with me everywhere. And at first, the monks only addressed him. When I finally made it up the hierarchy to the general secretary, they finally stopped talking to him, and then they started talking to me. But it took a long time. So these things were very difficult. And also, they thought I was a dilettante. You see, it's the other side. They didn't understand what I was trying to do. And it's very difficult to explain. And now they're interviewing me, and the book is in their publications, and they keep on asking me, how is it that you can understand aspects of Indian spirituality? They keep on thinking I must have had a guru, I think. But then it's hard for them to see it as an intellectual project. And yet they're wonderful, they're happy because they also feel that Vivekananda belongs to the world and not just to Bengalis or to Indians. The people who've been most upset with me in India are 2 Bengalis who feel that it belongs to Bengal. And they have written very unpleasant things. And I find that extraordinary because from the beginning, Vivekananda advocated going outside.
There was also in Stephen's examples fierce opposition in the state.
Yes, and now that's what I'm going to talk about now. Yeah. Well, what's going on there is that the missionaries, he talks about them. He doesn't know about all the people that you're talking about. He doesn't even know about them, though he would be interested in that. Why do they hate him so much? Well, he has a famous line at the Parliament where he says, "It is a sin to call you sinners." Mm-hmm. And when he says that, and then he goes on to defame, not to defame, but to deny the doctrine of original sin. And people who were there later recall that in the room, everybody went, all the people from Chicago, because despite the fact that they are very influenced by Darwinism, well, not evolution, they're very influenced by biblical criticism, this Protestant audience, they are still horrified. They all have been raised in some form of Calvinist households, even if it's a modified Calvinism. And to actually hear somebody go on about that is very disturbing. The other thing that's disturbing is that later with time, he worships and acknowledges Christ as an avatara, as a god incarnated on earth, as he would Krishna or Shiva. And you can imagine what Christians felt about that. And from the very beginning, he says that the exclusivism of Christianity is what torments him, not, the Sermon on the Mount. That is not what upsets him, of course. And finally, I think that the final reason why they're so upset is that they feel that, I don't know, do they talk about him as a seducer?
No, but there's one where they talk about him as wanting to undermine US marriages.
That's it. So there is this idea, as you know, today we talk about gurus in the West who use their position of direction to have relationships with their disciples. Well, this is raised through the side, in a sideways way. But there's something about the seductiveness and the fact that he is willing and able to have these intimate relationships with women, while at the same time maintaining the boundary, is seen as too close. And of course, this is the moment of novels like Trilby, where, there's the Svengali. He is, the potential Svengali, that he will seduce, even if it's not literally, but figuratively, by taking people away, especially women, from their duty, and finally, there is the problem of, the fact that he's interested in science, and his critique, like many of these Asians, is that Christianity is obscurantist. It refuses the new science. It refuses evolution, So he's presenting himself as more progressive. And at the same time, he's also saying that he still thinks, though, that science should be a handmaiden to spirituality, that there's something beyond science. And so it goes into all these other forms of belief, alternative beliefs, that Orthodox Christians find terrifying, that they're going to lose people to things like Christian Science, and New Thought, and hypnotism, and mesmerism, and forms of healing that just well, Christian Science, it wasn't the case, but will take the Christian framework away from them. So yeah, he is dangerous, and I'm really glad to hear that he was written up in all the Christian press, because it makes me feel that I was right. The impact is immense. A negative impact is impact nonetheless. We all remember bad reviews. In fact, they burn in our hearts. The good ones are but the ones that are bad, and I think they tell us so much about what really bothers people,
We always leave a moment or two for questions, or at least 5 minutes or so. Are there any? Yes, sir.
What I'm actually saying is something, I hope, more complex,
Yes.
which is that this idea that somehow Vivekananda, I'm talking about Vivekananda, but I'm also talking about the idea that India is the guru to the world, and that's really a dangerous idea. It's both a wonderful idea, but a dangerous idea, that it reifies this essentialism that India is spiritual and the West is materialistic. And we all know in our hearts that in India there are a lot of spiritual people, but there are a lot of people who aren't spiritual at all. And similarly, this notion that the West is materialist and nothing more, or defined by that, is dangerous. And he contributed to that discourse immensely. But what I'm also arguing is that because of the difficulty of the power relations and the prevalence, the backdrop of these Orientalist cliches, it's also how he enters into this world and makes an impact. Because he can keep on saying, you people are brutal. We're spiritual. And of course, that enables him to sidestep often these questions, particularly about women. Because what he has before is this woman named Ramabai, who comes west. She's converted to Christianity, and she is also a pandit. She's a Brahmin. She's almost unique in the extent of her Sanskrit knowledge. And she says, do not be attracted to the ethical flights of Hinduism. Hinduism is intrinsically misogynist. She says this. She reads all the texts. She knows it all, and he is trying to say, no, don't listen to her. He comes afterward, and yet the issue of women is always with him, because he has his mother and her plight. He doesn't want Western emancipation. He doesn't want the West to be a template for change in India. And at the same time, he can't imagine his mother remarrying. She's a widow, because it's spiritual abandon. But this idea of widows in India, you can be two and be a widow. That means your whole life you're a widow. And this is what Pandita Ramabai was fighting against. And of course, so what happens is he shifts constantly when the issue of women is raised, and he shifts from that to saying that it's you who are brutal. You see, so in talking in these dichotomies constantly, or these binaries, there's very little that can move, and yet He's constantly trying to move the idea that Indians are just pure spirit and transcendental and don't understand real life. So that he tries to move. That's he tries to move that cliche. So he's both propagating the cliches and trying to undermine them. And that is the defensiveness and the difficulty of communication, but also the possibility of communication. And it's in that paradox that universalism and nationalism are contained. And hence, because of that, he's constantly on edge and on the defensive. But we're also talking about the high point of imperialism. This is the moment when Bengal is in the grip of famine. India it's the worst. And people are just, everyone talks about the Renaissance, the Bengal Renaissance, but it's about this tiny crust of intellectuals. Whereas the people in Bengal their standard of living is falling. And then they get the plague as well. I mean, there's 12 million people who die in the famine between 1897 and 1906, something like that. So you see, we're dealing, when he quotes the Bible and says we're hungry, well, he doesn't quote it, but he talks about the Bible, and you give me a stone. He's actually talking about something he really knows about. Yeah. So it's in that context that we have to understand what he's saying. Please. Well, that's why it was so important to me to express that side of Vivekananda that was feminine and that connected with all these women. And also to understand that he always saw himself as operating beneath Ramakrishna and Sharada. And yet her story is also deeply idealized, because on the one hand, when she's in Calcutta, she's in purdah the whole time, and she's veiled when she comes out to give darshan. But when she's in her local village, she takes the veil off. And there she runs the show. And we don't know what happens there. But in the end, she takes one of Ramakrishna's sisters or nieces, and she raises her as her own child. So again, it's the celibate woman who nonetheless can become a mother. Yeah. So again, these complications, and this is why Vivekananda, he calls Margaret Noble his Celtic lioness. This is another idealization. I don't know what he meant by Celtic in this thing, but she, finally, after he dies, says that the idealizations meant that there are aspects of herself that he never saw. So the question then becomes, is it because he's a sannyasin? Is it celibacy? Is it the anti-householder bias that has been now spread across everything? And yet, on the other hand, you could see him as the total champion of the householder activist. So we're back again and again to these contradictions. And I think that what you're really saying is the legacy in terms of these institutions is very different from what he, I think, would have envisaged for them. But I'm not sure. This is just what I think. But I agree with you. They're very male institutions. And even though they're not supposed to be based on caste, I have a friend who's a Dalit who said that most of the monks were Brahmins. And he felt it. Yeah.
The book's subtitle is The Life and Legacy. I'm very grateful to you for the legacy question, because we have largely been talking about the life. But I think it's time to wrap up. And before we do, I would like you all to thank all three of our panelists today.
Thank you for coming.